So the Makerspace has a saw stop table saw. That is a saw that's equipped with some electronic technology that can sense if the blade comes in contact with anything with moisture in it. That could be your finger, but also could be just wet wood. If it senses it has low voltage electricity on the blade, and if that goes out into any moist surface, it causes the blade to, there's a block of aluminum on the bottom of the blade that a piston pushes that aluminum block into the blade. It stops the blade immediately and releases a spring that pushes the blade down below the table. It stops this from hurting you, but it totally destroys the blade and the cartridge, that the aluminum block. So it's a $150 event. If it saves your finger, we're happy to have it work, but we want to avoid doing it unnecessarily. So it's really important that you do not cut any wood that is moist. And there is a way to check it. If you have wood, there is a test sequence, but in general, the wood has to be dry. We don't use pressure-treated wood in this shop. That often has too much moisture in the inside, plus it's sort of toxic. So it's important that your wood be dry and that you do not let your fingers come in contact with the blade. But if you do, there is a good amount of protection. So normally when you come in, you will probably find, when you normally come in, you will find the saw has been unplugged. That's sort of the normal mode that we would like to have this machine left in. The reason is that if it's left plugged in, a lot of times people forget to shut off the main switch, and the saw is active and ready to go, and sometimes the door is left open. We don't want anyone to come in and fool around with this machine and accidentally hurt themselves. Theoretically, they're protected with the saw stop, but we can never be sure. So we try to leave this guy unplugged. The saw has a heavy-duty fence, which is released with this big red lever. It has a gauge line, a little indicator line here that gives you an indication of what the width of the cut is. The one on the right side is for right of the blade. The left one is only if you pick the fence up and lift it and put it over on the other side, and there's a little gauge over here for measuring. So this one on the left you don't really look at normally. The controls on the machine, on the front of the machine, there's a hand crank that raises and lowers the blade. It has a lock in the middle, so sometimes that might be tightened, so you've got to loosen that up to move the blade up and down. On the right side of the machine, there's another hand wheel that tilts the blade to the left, and there's a gauge on the front of the machine that tells you what angle it's at. So normally the saw is going to be at 0 or 90 degrees. We have, this is the normal guard that is going to be on the machine. We like to have this left on. There is another, you can take this off, but we like to have this on. This is the safest mode for operation. When you get started, you're going to want to set the height of your blade, and the normal correct height is, the height should be that the gullet of the tooth is, the bottom of the gullet is about at the height of the top of your board. So just the sort of tooth is sticking up above your board. This has these two black arms with a little piece here, and that is to give you an indication of how high the blade is. And so you don't have to lift this up normally. You can use this. These have to be snapped down into these little things here to be at the right height, but that's roughly the top of the blade. So you want about ½ inch of space between your board and these guys, this black arm here. That'll give you the proper height to your blade. So I have the saw unplugged, so I'm going to lift this up. There are also two big anti-kickback fingers here that are spring-loaded, and there's two smaller ones underneath. These can be locked, the big ones can be locked up on a little notch there. The little ones stay, and they're not removable, or can't take them out of play. But these are meant to stop the board from kicking back when you're cutting. So a table saw, there's always danger that the wood will pinch on the back side of the blade. And if that happens, the blade can propel that piece of wood backwards. So the space behind the blade is called the kickback zone. And that's because it can at times propel wood backwards that way. And it is shot back almost at the speed of a bullet. So it's incredibly dangerous. So you can never have someone working behind you in that zone when you're operating the table saw. So you want to have the blade set at the proper height. You want to have this guard down here. And this has, currently the blade that's on here is a 24-tooth rip blade. It's designed for ripping with the ripping is going with the grain, solid wood. So, the wood sometimes can pinch on the back side of the blade. So we have a splitter here, this piece of metal right behind the blade that's meant to prevent the wood from pinching in on the blade and sending it shooting backwards. The other dangerous thing is whenever you use a fence, the fence is when you lock it down, is sort of an immovable object. And whenever you have the wood trapped between an immovable object and the blade, if the wood gets pushed over against the blade, it can send it backwards, shooting backwards. So it's always dangerous if that wood, gets caught on the back of the blade. It can send it shooting backwards. So we want to try to always avoid that. The splitter really helps with that because it won't let the wood pinch around once it gets onto this splitter, but there is a little gap there between those. When you approach this, come up to this machine, a lot of people are intimidated by the power. All these machines have a lot of power, but this one is probably the most powerful motor of any in the shop. And so a lot of people are intimidated by that, and they sort of want to stand away from the machine. I'm always recommending that you get really close to the machine, because this bar here, this part of the fence, is really firmly bolted to the machine. The machine weighs several hundred pounds. It's an immovable object. And if you get in close to it, you're then not leaning over as you push the wood through. If you stand back here, when you go to push the wood through, you're sort of leaning over, and you might lose your balance and sort of fall into the machine. When you're standing here, if you stand close to the machine, I like to stand on either the left side of the saw, or if I'm going this way, on the right side. But I'm not, once again, just like with the planer, I'm seldom standing straight on to the saw blade if I can help it. I want to be one side or the other. First, just talk about ripping a basic board, solid wood board. When you're going to be ripping wood, you're going to be standing to the left side of the blade, usually. Some people are used to doing it from this side. That's all right if that's what you're used to doing, but normally I'm standing on this side of the blade. I have my left hand is responsible for pushing the board down to the table and pushing it into the fence. So your board, this is where you've gone and flattened a face and straightened an edge. Your flat face should be down to the table and your straight edge should be against the fence. You don't want to have a board that has a rough edge here going through the table saw, because if it's going, wobbly on the side to the fence, it can push when you get to a high spot, it might push the board over into the back side of that saw blade and cause it to kick back. So you need to have a straight edge on this side. If you can't run it through the joiner, you can use a skill saw or something with a chalk line to straighten it before you send it through. But you want to have a straight edge against this fence. So your left hand is responsible for pushing down, pushing it into the fence here. Your right hand is going to support the board and push it forward through the blade. If you have a really long board and it's too hard to hold up this end, we do have a roller stand here, which you could set up, and you have to adjust the height and get it nice and straight to the table, but then long board can sit on this and be supported. The outfeed table will support the piece going out usually enough, so you don't need, but you could put a roller out there if you need to as well. So we're going to want to have your left hand holding it down and pushing it in. The other job that this black metal, these two metal rods are doing, is to remind you that your hand, this left hand, you'll see, this is about 4 inches away from this red throat plate. Red throat plate is an area where you do not want to have your hand. So this is to remind you to not move this left hand any closer to the blade. So you bump into that, it's for a reason to say stop, don't let that hand go any closer. You're going to push this through as you make the cut, and this hand stays right in this zone. Once you get to here, your right hand is going to take over, pushing the board all the way through. And the left hand becomes free. One of the things you can do if you're having to lean out to push that through is your left hand can come around and grip this big rail here to give you more stability. That 4-inch rule that we have of this groove here for the miter gauge, there's a slot in the machine, is just about 4 inches away from the blade. So if the fence is outside of this dado groove, this groove for the miter gauge, that means you can push it through with your hand. If it's closer, you want to use a push stick. And we have 2 different types here. We have a sort of long-handled one with a little end on it. And we have this homemade wooden one that has a handle up here. The nice thing about this one is you can actually push down on the piece more with this one, pushing it through. And, but either one of these, if you're going to use these, they have to be close enough that you can reach them when you get to the critical point of needing them, because you can't use them until the board is all the way up onto the table. If you push out here, it would just push the board down and it would lift it up in the table. You wouldn't want that. So you have to have your push sticks at the ready to use those to push through. But this, I'm going to run this one just with my hand because I'm outside the 4-inch distance, and I've got to come a little bit closer to be able to get a cut, but there. So I'm ready to make a cut. This gauge is pretty accurate, but if you really are doing something that's precise, you're going to need to make a test cut or measure. You can, before you get going, you can lift up the guard and take a tape measure and measure from here to the side of the blade. Once you sort of determine, you can set this at some measure and then check it to see if it's correct, because this can get out of adjustment. So you've got the machine sort of ready to go. We have our board ready. We're going to now need to plug it in and turn on the electronic switch. So I'm going to plug it in over here. I've got the gate open. I shut the gate from the last machine. I'm going to come over here, and there's sort of two-step process here. There's a toggle switch that is colored yellow, and you are going to, once you plug it in, you turn that upward, and these two lights are going to start come on. One green and one red, which is going to flash for a little bit. That's when the machine is checking the electronic safety mechanism. It's sending out some electricity through the system and checking to see that it's all in working order. Once it gets through that check stage, it's going to go to one green light on the left. That means the machine's ready to go. To turn it on, there's a big red paddle on the left side. You're going to pull that paddle out. That'll turn the machine on. When you're in nice and close here, which is where I recommend you stand, if you should get into trouble and the machine, something's happening you don't like, you don't have to take your hands off your piece of wood to shut the machine off. You can just hit that switch with your knee. So it's right there, right where your knee is. And so if you ever have any problem with the machine, instead of having to reach down and let go of your piece of wood, you can hold on to it and with your knee shut the machine off. The other thing about the fence, it's really important that this red handle be pushed all the way down. This has to be really, really firm to have this operate safely. You can't just push it a little bit, you've got to push it all the way down. Make sure it's locked firmly. So I've got the gate for the dust collector open, and I'm going to turn the machine on. Another thing to remember is when you're cutting your wood and you go through, you want to push this wood all the way past this part of the top mechanism here, right past the red throat plate. All right, so we just want to make sure when we push it through, we're going to push it all the way through to the far side so that it's totally clear of the saw. So I've got the fence set. I'm going to start up the dust collection. I've got the gate open. I shut the gate on the other past machines. The anti-kickback finger is going to hold your little scrap piece so that it doesn't slide back, and you can just pull that out that way, and you've got your finished cut here.